No one expected a Hollywood icon to walk 12 miles in silence. Not under that sun. Not with no camera crew. And certainly not holding a letter that had been folded so many times. The ink had started to fade. The locals watched from a distance confused. Some recognized the face, but no one dared stop him. He looked like a man searching for something, or running from something. But his feet didn't run. They just walked. Dust curled around his boots. His shirt clung to his back. And in his eyes something that didn't belong to fame. It was the look of a man holding on by a thread. The silence around him was loud. Even the birds seemed to stay away from his path. And every step he took led him closer to the one place he couldn't avoid anymore. He didn't say a word. Not to the driver who dropped him off at the edge of the village. Not to the old man offering him water. Not to the young boy who asked, "Are you lost?" He simply nodded and kept walking. Toward the gates of Ibrahim Traoré. This wasn't about a film. This wasn't about politics. This was personal. 10 days earlier, Matthew McConaughey had been standing on a red carpet in Los Angeles smiling, waving, doing what everyone expected of him. But inside, something had cracked. That night, back in his hotel room, he had opened an old notebook. Tucked in the back was a letter. A letter he had written years ago but never sent. The name at the top? Ibrahim Traoré. Why Traoré? Why would an American actor carry a letter for years? Written to the leader of a West African nation he had. Never met? Even Matthew wasn't sure anymore. But that letter held a truth. And Traoré, somehow, was the only person he believed could hear it, without judgment. The journey had started quietly. No press, no announcement. Just a one-way ticket and silence. He didn't bring a suitcase, only a small bag. And that letter, worn, creased, heavy with time. Somewhere along the road, his past had started to speak again. Moments he had buried, words he had never said, a voice he hadn't used in years. The further he walked, the more the world around him seemed to disappear. It was just the path, and the truth he had carried too long. A child called out behind. Him. "Mister, are you okay?" But he didn't turn. Not because he didn't hear, but because if he stopped now, he might never start again. He passed a man on a bicycle who slowed down and stared at him in disbelief. The man didn't speak. He just watched. And for a split second, it felt like even the earth paused. That's the strange thing about grief. You can hide it under smiles. You can bury it beneath success. But when it starts to leak out, the whole world notices, even if they don't understand why. The heat pressed harder now. His back ached. His lips were dry. But he didn't stop. 12 miles. Every step felt like it belonged to another version of him. The boy who had lost something. The man who never faced it. And now, the soul trying to make peace with it. The gates were in sight now. Simple, quiet, unimposing. 2 guards stood at either side. Confused, then surprised, then alert. One whispered something into his earpiece. The other stared. Then slowly opened the gate. No questions. No resistance. Just a long silence as Matthew McConaughey stepped forward. Past the guards. Past the trees. Toward the man waiting at the far end of the compound. Traoré, standing alone. No advisors. No cameras. Just him. And as Matthew got closer, something inside him began to break. Not from fear, but from the weight of all the years he had held this back. He stopped a few steps away, looked into Traoré's eyes, and whispered, barely loud enough to be heard, "There's only one sentence I came here to say." But he didn't finish it. Not yet. because the tears came first. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight. He just stood there, watching McConaughey slowly crumble in front of him. Not the actor, not the star. Just a man, exhausted, emotional, and holding a silence that had grown too heavy to carry alone. For a moment, there was nothing. No words, just a soft breath of wind between them, and the letter shaking in Matthew's hand. Traoré stepped forward, not with power, but with presence. The kind that didn't ask questions. The kind that made you feel like you didn't need to explain everything. He reached out slowly and gestured toward a bench beneath an old tree, a place away from ears, away from the world. They sat. A long breath passed, and then Matthew spoke. I was 14 when I watched my father die in front of me. His voice cracked, even on the first sentence. It was a heart attack, quick, sudden. I was the only one there. My mom was at work, my brother away. He looked at the sky for a moment. But it wasn't the death that stayed with me. It was the last thing he said to me. Traoré listened. No interruptions. He told me, "Make sure your voice doesn't lie, son. That's all." Then he was gone. Matthew's hands trembled. He looked down at them like they weren't his. I carried those words into everything I did, into every movie, every line, every interview. But somewhere along the way, my voice stopped being mine. His eyes met Traoré's again. The fame got louder than the truth. And the more people clapped, the more I forgot who I was clapping for. A pause. Years passed. Roles came and went. Awards, red carpets, the whole dream. But the truth? I couldn't sleep. Traoré finally spoke, softly. And the letter? Matthew nodded, gripping it tighter. This letter, I wrote it 8 years ago. The night I first saw you speak to your people on a rainy day, without a microphone, without a stage. Just your voice. And for the first time in years, I remembered what a real voice sounds like. He handed the letter to Traoré, but Traoré didn't open it. Not yet. It's not political, Matthew said. It's not a request. It's just a piece of me I lost, that I'm trying to give back. A long silence followed. The tree above them dropped a leaf between their feet. Time slowed. You didn't come here to be heard, Traoré said. You came here to be felt. Matthew swallowed, his throat dry, his eyes wet. I guess I did. Traoré looked at the letter again, still unopened, still full of weight. Tell me what's inside. He said, not the words. Tell me what it feels like. Matthew leaned back, closing his eyes for a second. It feels like watching your own soul from a distance. It feels like remembering who you were before the noise. Another pause. It feels like honesty, finally. Traoré didn't smile, but something in his face softened. Then speak it, he said. Matthew looked up. His lips parted, but his voice still refused to come. He shook his head gently, wiped his face with his sleeve, and whispered, I don't know if I can. Traoré didn't rush him, didn't fill the silence. He just let it exist, because sometimes it's not the sentence that's hard to say, it's what's buried underneath it. A minute passed, then another. Traoré looked toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to drop, painting the sky in soft gold. You know, he said quietly, the strongest sentence a man can speak is the one that trembles out of his chest. Matthew stayed silent, but his breathing slowed. Traoré added, I've seen men command armies with their voice, and I've seen men fall apart just trying to say the truth to themselves. He turned toward Matthew. You came here with truth. That already makes you stronger than most. Matthew gave a weak smile. I've lived in front of cameras so long. I forgot what it's like to speak without a lens watching me. Traoré leaned forward. You're not being watched here. You're being witnessed. Matthew blinked. There was something in that word, witnessed, that reached in deeper than anything else so far. He stared at the letter again, then back at Traoré. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why didn't you ask what the sentence is? Aren't you curious? Traoré gave a slight shrug. I don't need to know it first. Some truths aren't meant to be studied, just respected. Matthew looked down, his voice a whisper. It's not a beautiful sentence. It's not powerful or poetic. Traoré responded without hesitation. Then it's probably real. Matthew breathed in deeply, and for the first time, something inside him began to loosen. The letter sat between them, soft, aged, fragile. Traoré finally lifted it, holding it like something sacred. He didn't unfold it yet. Instead, he looked at McConaughey and said, You've carried this longer than it was meant to be carried. Matthew nodded, but he still couldn't speak. His chest rose and fell like he'd been holding his breath for years. Not the kind of breath you lose from running. The kind you lose from hiding. Traoré unfolded the paper. Each crease whispered of time. Each corner worn down by hands that had opened and closed it 100 times, without ever delivering it. The words were short, simple, written in black ink. Traoré read silently, and Matthew watched him the way a man watches a mirror, terrified of what he might see reflected back. Then Traoré looked up. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pretend to understand it all. He just said, This sentence is not meant for me to read out loud. It's meant for you to release. Matthew looked down, ashamed, like a child who had broken something too valuable to fix. The sentence, Matthew whispered, isn't hard because of the words. It's hard because of what comes after it. Traoré tilted his head. What comes after it? Matthew's eyes welled again. The truth. The silence that comes once it's out. And the fear that maybe no one will forgive me for saying it. Traoré didn't blink. Then say it anyway. Matthew looked away, and finally, he began to speak. I once stood on a stage, years ago, at an awards show. Everyone was clapping, cameras flashing. And in that moment, I lied. Traoré leaned in, listening. I thanked everyone, my team, my fans, God. But the one person I didn't thank was the person I blamed for everything. A long pause, my father. The words hit the air like thunder that had been waiting too long to break. Matthew continued. I blamed him for dying, for leaving me at 14, for not teaching me how to be a man. And I carried that blame into every role I ever played, trying to become the man I never met. His voice cracked. I wore mask called confidence. I spoke with a voice that wasn't mine, and every time someone told me I inspired them, I felt like a fraud. He looked directly at Traoré now, until I saw you, standing in the rain, speaking to your people like they were family. No script, no makeup, no mask. Traoré sat quietly, taking it in, not as a leader, not as a figure, just as a man, listening to another man fall apart in front of him. That night, Matthew said, I wrote this letter, and at the end of it, I wrote one sentence. The one sentence I was too afraid to speak out loud. His hand reached for the paper. Traoré gently passed it back. Matthew unfolded it, not to read, but to face it. His lips trembled. I said, I don't know who I am without the lie. The words floated there, soft, broken, raw, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sentence itself. Silence held the air like a string pulled tight. Even the wind seemed to pause. Matthew McConaughey sat with his hands resting on his knees, the old letter trembling between his fingers. The sentence he had buried for years, the one line that had kept him awake, torn him apart, and shaped how the world saw him, was now out. I don't know who I am without the lie. Traoré sat still. His gaze wasn't sharp. It wasn't judging. It wasn't even curious. It was simply present. And for the first time in what felt like years, Matthew let his shoulders drop. He wasn't acting. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to hold anything together anymore. He was just there, a man, raw and unguarded. I built a whole life on top of that lie, Matthew said softly. I didn't mean to. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was being strong. But it was survival, not honesty. Traoré didn't nod, didn't rush in with comforting words. He just let Matthew speak, the way a mountain lets a storm. Pass over it. I spent years making people feel something on screen, Matthew continued. But I stopped feeling anything off screen. He rubbed his hands together, trying to ground himself. There were nights I'd stare into the mirror and not recognize the man looking back. I'd smile in interviews and wonder, who is this voice coming from? He shook his head. I started believing the characters more than I believed myself. Traoré spoke, his voice low and even. That's not a lie. That's grief wearing different clothes. Matthew looked at him, surprised. Traoré continued, You didn't lie to the world. You tried to protect yourself from the hole your father left behind. You didn't become someone else to deceive. You became someone else to survive. Matthew sat with those words. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave it shape. I don't know who I'd be if he had stayed, Matthew said. And I don't know who I became because he didn't. Traoré nodded slowly. Sometimes we don't become who we are. We become what's left. Matthew closed his eyes. Not out of sorrow, but release. He let out a breath that had been trapped inside for decades. This isn't what I expected. He said, What did you expect? Traoré asked. Matthew gave a small, tired smile. A conversation. Maybe a handshake. Maybe I'd read the letter, feel better, then go home. He paused, but I didn't think I'd feel seen. Traoré leaned forward slightly. You came all this way to say one sentence. But maybe that sentence brought you here to hear something. Matthew looked at him, waiting. You are. Not the lie, Traoré said. You are the man who carried it and chose to lay it down. The words hit deep, not with drama, but with quiet truth. Matthew looked down at the letter again. Then, carefully, he tore it in half. Then, again, and again, until the pieces lay softly in his lap like falling ash. Traoré didn't stop him. Some truths need to be kept. Others need to be released. A breeze passed through the courtyard, lifting a few pieces of the torn paper into the air. They danced briefly in the light, then drifted gently to the ground. For a moment, neither man said a word. Matthew stood. Traoré stood with him. There was no hug, no dramatic farewell. Just a glance, steady, human, honest. And then, Traoré said something that Matthew would never forget. The next time you speak, let it be your voice, not the one the world taught you to use. Matthew didn't respond with words. He just nodded. A small nod, but the kind that meant everything. He turned, walking back down the same path he came, but he wasn't the same man anymore. The road was still long. The dust still rose beneath his boots, but something inside him had shifted. No cameras had caught it. No headlines would write about it, but a man had returned to himself. And for the first time in years, Matthew McConaughey didn't feel like he was pretending. If this story touched something deep inside you, if it reminded you of a truth you've buried for too long, then don't just scroll. Leave your story below. Someone might need it. And if you believe in real voices, in honest stories, and in healing through truth, like this video. Subscribe. More stories like this are waiting to be heard. Sometimes the loudest part of you is the silence you've been too afraid to share. But healing begins the moment you finally whisper the truth.